would like to welcome up the first speaker of the affirmative to start their team's case.
Policing in the United States has failed. We saw this when Breonna Taylor was brutally murdered in her apartment in a botched drug investigation. We saw this when George Floyd cried out, "I can't breathe," as police kneeled on his neck until he died. For these reasons, we are proud to propose. We will win this debate by proving that reducing the US police force provides better outcomes for people. In my speech today, firstly, I'm going to talk about the causes of crime and our alternative solution through our model. Then I'm going to speak about the harms of the current US police force and why reform won't work. My second speaker, Lily, will offer her split point, that being about how our model raises awareness. So, firstly, the causes of crime is that we say that police are unsuited to address all crime because it doesn't actually reduce the root of the problem. We tell you that crime occurs because of a variety of complex reasons. Firstly, mental health issues, right? We tell you that police are not trained to deal with, say, an instance like a manic bipolar disorder phase. We need a psychologist to actually deal with and address that issue. Secondly, we see crime as a result of poverty, right? People just need to survive. They need to make money to fulfill their basic needs, and this incentivizes them to commit crime. Thirdly, it's really difficult to get footing back in society or get a job again if you have previously offended in the past, because you've got no real support, and therefore you're highly likely to re-offend again. Fourthly, because it's more accessible to commit crime than in these instances, when things like welfare are really difficult to access, when the benefit that you're being given is still below the living wage. Therefore, police, we tell you, are frequently dealing with crime that has really complex reasons for why it occurs, and generally it doesn't actually fix or address the root of the problem or why this crime is occurring in the first place, and it doesn't solve anything by just policing these groups and putting these people into prison. We address these issues of crime under our model by, firstly, we support activists and political candidates, campaigning in the US to defund the police and reduce the size. In this way, we reduce the function of police to key functions, such as apprehending violent offenders whom are at risk to the community, and investigating large-scale crime. Therefore, current police functions, such as community patrol, such as mental health call-outs, such as minor drug crimes, such as traffic patrol, are delegated to government and community organisations that are best suited to address such issues and prevent them from happening in the future. Under our model, we also invest the current police force's massive budget into alternative means, things such as education, creating jobs, sustainable jobs for people in the long term, such as healthcare, making that more accessible. For instance, we address some of the issues we see with mental health by putting money towards things like therapy and counselling, making healthcare more accessible by lowering the cost. So therefore, in our world, we see a reduction of crime because we've targeted the roots of why people actually commit these crimes. So why is our model going to work? Well, we tell you 3 reasons. Firstly, activists and political candidates already have this platform, in real life, but also on social media, to raise awareness about these issues, right? This helps them to inspire voters, and particularly people who may feel disenfranchised from the current system, say for instance Black people. We also see that Black Lives Matter and police brutality is more relevant now than ever before, and therefore people are more engaged in this discussion. And lastly, we already told you that on the ground we see that people are suffering, right? Particularly minorities such as Black people, right? They don't want to have their communities patrolled by cops with guns, right? While their kids are just going to play at the park, right? Therefore, they have an incentive to support these campaigns because they want their communities to feel safer.
When police decide what type of police will stay, older police which are well entrenched in the system, or newer, more aware police?
Well, we'll say that the police will continue to see new police coming in to join the police force. Like, we acknowledge that in the short term, there will still be like some police that have been there for a long time, but eventually, as the system updates, we still see like new police coming in and just fulfilling their role, doing as what I told you before, like investigating large-scale crime and apprehending violent offenders. Okay, now onto the harms of the US police force, right? We tell you that that policing creates distrust between the government and communities. Two reasons for this. Firstly, when you have like police carrying weapons, that increases your tensions in the community because it makes people feel more vulnerable and unsafe because they've got someone who like evidently has more power than you. Secondly, police have an incentive to arrest people, even if it's like a low priority crime, because it's like better for their department, because it means their department gets more funding. If they're like arresting more people, more crimes being committed, it's good for the police because they get like better resources and maybe an increased wage. And so they're likely to have an incentive to like look for these minor offences. This is bad because they might say like prioritize something like the arrest of like a 17-year-old kid for like smoking like weed. We say that that is actually worse for the individual because one, it doesn't address the reasons for why they were like in that position in the first place. Secondly, it goes on their record forever. It makes it really hard for them to have a footing in society and get a job. On the comparative, the actual harm that they were committing to the community is relatively low, right? They just need some kind of like support and encouragement, but it doesn't look like this like massive problem that needed the police to intervene. It could have easily been someone like a counsellor or social support. Secondly, police have a racial bias, right? We tell you that the US police force is made up of predominantly white men who likely have more exposure to like their own race and like which is informed by their own beliefs and values, right? The police force is also going to be trained by older, likely more conservative cops that probably are more informed by like racist beliefs and values. The police system is also informed by like racist historic legislation, like we see with things like the Jim Crow laws, for instance, right? And so police are way more likely to carry out these unconscious biases when they commit crime. The outcome of these things is that it's just like a massive life ruiner for people that pushes lots of people into crime because they have like low alternatives, right? And the police are unfairly policing minorities, those already struggling, who actually just needed to be provided with support. So why won't reform work? Well, we tell you that anti-bias training has proven to just create more resentment and bias. We tell you that Black and other like minority cops still have to function under the same laws and trainings and pressure, and therefore like adding more Black cops into the system doesn't actually achieve like anti-racism. We still see an over-patrolling of like what are high crime areas, which tend to be like Black communities. We see like over-policed communities are really likely to continue to distrust a reformed police system, and they'll likely refuse to cooperate with this system. Our better because this new organisation helps like a community with people that they are able to cooperate and trust with, and it lessens the frequency of crime.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now welcome up the first speaker of the negating team.
The significance of progressive activists and political candidates on the US political scene have had huge impacts on the voter base and the system as a whole. These activists and candidates are necessary for maintaining the functionality of the US political system in its intention to represent the population as a whole in a balanced manner. So the affirming team's case today has hinged on the horrors of the past being enough to justify the defunding of police and reducing their core functionality so as to solve all the issues which remain at the status quo. To support our side of the house this evening, I, as the first speaker, will be talking about the alienation of the progressive wing and then the danger on the police force of such political campaigns. And my second speaker will be talking about how interactions with police are damaged in marginalised communities. Firstly, I'd like to point out some flaws in the affirming team's case. So firstly, they made a suggestion about diverting funds usually spent on the police into education. So on our side, we continue to use these same funds to educate policemen, right? We still want to solve these issues. We still continue delegating these funds to assist in such training. But the issue with this proposal is that they try to continue this education while also actively villainizing these policemen, right? And you imagine which situation is going to result in better outcomes for the awareness and for the performance of police, right? A situation in which they're actually being educated as opposed to one which they're supposedly being educated while also being villainized by society as a whole and by the government. Also, the first speaker also talked about the tension generated by police, being armed in the communities, having guns. But the issue which we have with this, imagine the tension which will be generated when a civilian is at risk, right? They're at risk of their own safety without law enforcement individual anywhere near in the area. You can imagine the tension which that would generate for individuals, and that is the reality which the affirming team is supporting. Another thing mentioned by the first speaker was how the police force is made up of conservative policemen and how this justifies their case. But as proposition will lead only to the most radical, conservative, fanatical police officers remaining in the police force after the rest have been cut off, right? This will be integrated into my substantive point, to which I begin now. That being the alienation of the progressive wing in the United States. So campaigning to defund and decrease the police force is a very radical stance for a political party, for a political figure, or for a wing to take. While such an idea may appeal to a minority of voters, the reality is that these voters likely already are attached to these progressive wings, right? So this isn't expanding the voter base for these progressive wings in their favor in any way whatsoever. So there's much more harm to the progressives across the voter base and the perception generated through implementing such a radical stance, right? We've got two mechanisms for how this happens. The first is the sense of security, which may have been previously attached to the police force, and the issue on this, the attachment to the values of the voter base. So the average civilian often has a significant fear of crime, right? Fear of crime is a major value in the average civilian. And police act somewhat as a calming figure, right? You've got the police there, their entire purpose is law enforcement, is to prevent crime, and they are there in the flesh to provide security, which these civilians, fearing of crime, often need. So to then have a candidate wanting to defund them, this will of course cause outrage in the minds of voters who fear for their safety, and then it generates fear towards those political groups themselves, right? And all of this generates because a lot of these systems will we'll see the policemen as calming figures. So then to have a political group come along and say defund them will develop a major distaste, negative perception towards the progressive wing as a whole. Now, a second mechanism which we've brought out on our side is how it proves how all of this proves claims by the media, right? Because often it's these conservative and centrist media outlets depicts the progressive wing as being very radical, right? And this is often simply due to the perception or just the fundamental belief in this, as opposed to actual solid evidence. But the issue on our side, the issue which we have on our side is that such an aggressive move by the progressive wing would provide the hard evidence which these media outlets needs to supports their claims and like to validate these claims, and it would generate an even more widespread perception amongst the actual voter base themselves now that it is like the progressive wings were radical, you shouldn't vote for them. So here's the outcome of this. Such negative perception like generated towards the progressive ring would take away from what they really stand for, right? What they actually stand for prior to taking such an aggressive stance. So it takes away from their previous and impactful policies. For example, around like universal healthcare and higher minimum wages and the legalization of cannabis, which also happens to help people of color through the justice system who are most commonly convicted for such crimes.
On that.
So the voter base then ignores these policies, which have been previously like introduced, which this political wing, the progressives, had campaigned for, and now they just focus on this like aggressive political stance taken, and all of this takes away from the progress made by the progressive wing prior. And then again, that reduces the prospect of such policies being implemented at all in the future when like the public has got such a distaste towards the progressive wing. That brings me to my second point, that being the damages on the police force. So for this, we have to like imagine a scenario in which the progressive wing may have been able to overcome all this harm which has been caused in the voter base, which has been caused in the voters and across the polls, and now and have been able to actually implement their policy. So we have a few issues with this. So firstly, I'd like to highlight that there are currently systems in place to address issues in the police force. For example, you've got body cameras on officers newly implemented to increase accountability for their actions, right? You've got like the diversity police forces for better representation. You've also got systems to allocate policemen to regions where they can actually connect, like which they actually connect to, for example, areas which they grew up in. This is all systems, mechanisms currently in place by the government like in order to combat this issue. And our problem is that all of this is forgotten about as soon as like the police force is just decreased and defunded. This is indicative of a stance which believes that the best way to reduce the issues within the police force is simply to reduce its size. And that brings me to my next issue with that. And for this, we must ask the question, who actually remains after like the departments are told that they have to make cuts in their numbers or have to like reduce the number of policemen? There's going to be the most committed and the most loyal police forces who are most deeply integrated into those systems, into those departments who are going to remain. Like it's the like aware members, like the new members who are coming, who have been exposed to the training which have been recently implemented. They're the ones who are going to be cut off first, right? So now it's the policemen who are most deeply entrenched into their department and police force who remain. And these are the same individuals who are going, of course, to cause the most issue, right? They joined at a time when like anti-racism education didn't even exist at all. And they didn't go through the steps to become educated in issues which arise around police brutality in the current world. So what we're seeing here is a plaster solution which is only going to aggravate the wound. That is why we're extremely proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome up the second speaker of the affirming team.
Let's take a look at state governments like New York and Florida, whose police spending way outstrips the money spent on actual education, on college, on things like healthcare. On the affirming side, we cannot stand for this, and we want to see the funds moved to more effective places. The negating team just wants to continue shoveling money into an ineffective police force and just hope that it all works out. Before I drop into my 2 points of clash today and my substantive point about awareness, I'd like to critique the model, or more the lack of model offered by the negating team. They tell us that with the extra money, that they're going to throw their money into education of the police force. We'd rather throw our money into education to actually help the people of the future. We'd actually like to see us work on people who need the help, rather than the police, who's already squandering billions and billions of dollars a year. They then say that we sort of will have no policemen left, so that people will not feel safe in the streets because there is no enforcement. Clearly they haven't listened to the model outlined by the first speaker. She has told you that we are going to leave the police in place for things like violent crimes, to make sure that people are still safe, but we're not targeting these unnecessary incidents. They then offer no counter model, assuring that things are just going to fix themselves out in the future. Now to move on to my points of rebuttal. So a huge point brought up by the first speaker is about the alienation and how this is going to isolate people from the left. They say that this is politically so radical that people just aren't going to support it because it's just such a crazy idea. We had two responses here. First of all, the people who aren't voting are often the people who are most affected by this. It is the minorities, and somewhere like the States, Black people do not vote as high rates as white people. So if we offer these if we offer this defunding policy, we are supporting these people who are already not voting, so voters will be gained. But secondly, when we have activist groups and politicians talking about it, these people are going to be educated and not use the fear-mongering tactics that the negating team is trying to tell us. These people are going to be educated about the rational beliefs of the view, not just be thrown slogans like ACAB and defund the police and hope. These people are educated and they know how to get policies across. There's two main mechanisms identified under this point by the negating team. Firstly, that people feel safe in the police, and so if we try and defund them, we're going to outrage the public. Two responses here. Only the privileged feel calm by a police walking around their neighbourhood. Minorities do not feel safe when they're over-patrolled with guns and other things. It's really only the people at the top of the privileged basket that are calmed by the presence of police. But secondly, again, this misinformation and this outrage can be managed by these people who are experts in getting people to believe opinions. Instead of just leaving all these ideas to be thrown around and thrown at by conspiracy media, we allow them a platform where they can be explained rationally and logically. The second mechanism under this point that's brought up by the negating team is that these conservative and centrist media outlets will just leap on a reason to hate the radicals. First of all, there are media outlets that represent all sides. It's not just the Fox News. There's also places like CNN, the BBC, places that are known for their more sort of rational reporting, who occasionally will offer a left-wing perspective. But secondly, this fear-mongering is a really weak political tactic, right? To convince people to vote for you, you need to offer solutions. If you're constantly attacking why the other team is wrong, but not showing reasons why you're right, it's almost like a debate. You won't get voters. You need to have real physical policy, which is not offered by the negating team. They just say that ours is wrong and ours is scary. So at the end of this point, we've shown how, not only how people can be educated by these systems, but also that the negating team is, I'll take it.
Do you not believe that it is necessary to delegate funds to educate police so that the horrors of the past do not repeat themselves?
The thing is, right, is that the police system, as shown by my first speaker, is fundamentally broken. We've shown to you why anti-bias training, putting more police in, is not working. Why? Because people are resentful of these measures. They don't want to be helped. The system is fundamentally broken and cannot be fixed by these methods. Now onto the second point brought up by the first speaker. This one wasn't brought up as much, but essentially this is going to be a danger to the actual police force. They tell us that there are systems already in place to help make sure that the police force doesn't make any racist decisions. They use the body cam example and other measures like bringing in more diversity. Not only has it already shown us, I'm going to provide more rebuttal. When these measures are brought in, people try and leap around. If we look at body cams, they're being turned off in cases of examples, and police have protected immunity in America. So oftentimes they're not prosecuted for these minor instances of skirting the law. And Emma has shown you again why diversity does not work. Why? Because these people are still ruled, no matter what race they are, by the laws that the police were set up by. The police in the States were set up to prosecute slaves and get them back to their slave owners. These laws cannot be changed because of the US judicial system. It's very, very hard to throw out laws in the system, and instead there's just small changes made. So these people are still going to be ruling on laws that were made in racist times nearly hundreds of years ago. Another mechanism under this point brought up by the first speaker is that who's going to be left after this? It's going to be the loyal police and not the new aware ones that come in. Firstly, these new aware police, again, are not going to be having effective training. We've shown so many reasons why this reform and this new training is not making more radical police officers. But secondly, a police station has no incentive to keep its older police officers instead of the younger ones. Why? Because an old police officer is going to retire in about 5 to 10 years. They'd rather have a fresh new force who they can implement their way of life on for like 40 or 50 years. They have no incentive to keep the old fellow around. They want the new guy who they can impart their wisdom on, for years and years and years. Now to move on to my split point about awareness. So even though my first speaker has shown to you that these measures are likely to be put through, what happens if they're not? Under this system, we bring awareness and conversation to these topics. we take it from the public eye to the government. And there's three mechanisms under this point. Firstly, minorities. This allows issues that minorities are struggling with, like police brutality, to feel validated. I can't speak for every single minority, but a really big chunk of them do care about police brutality. And so we want to make sure these groups are not felt left out. As I've outlined before, these people aren't voting anyway. We want to empower them to make sure their concerns are heard and they feel safe to vote. Secondly, the public that's unaware. I've talked about how people may or may not be fearmongers. But these people, even though Black Lives Matter feels like it's everywhere, lots of people have really misguided ideas about it and misguided ideas about defunding the police. If we put it out into the public sphere, these trained people can talk about logical reasons. They have the political know-how to try and sway these people instead of leaving it to the bottom of the thing and trying to fearmonger. Lastly, this can help resisting governments. Governments don't really have pressure to make change unless their voters want change. If we allow these conversations to happen, we remind the government that all topics are worthy and we encourage them to think of change to support these new voters. So what are the outcomes of all this awareness? We can change the personal opinion of people who may be misguided or may not have information and open spaces for concerns to be aired and to be dealt with. Secondly, we put pressure on government to be held accountable for these faulty issues. Why? Because the government needs both. And the minorities is currently a group that is massively untapped because, again, they have lower voting rates. So we make these big visible issues really clear so that government can work on them. So at the end of my speech, what does our world look like? Our world looks like a space where arguments can be developed and brought out rationally to try and convince people in a rational and logical way. It also means that people's voices feel represented and they're inspired to vote and make change. The negating team's world means that these issues are not going to be brought up. These people will feel disenfranchised by the voting system, and the issues outlined by Emma and in my rebuttal are going to continue. So at the end of my speech, I've shown why clearly defunding the police and having people support this is the best solution for everyone.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now welcome up the second speaker of the negating team.
The choice in this debate today isn't between maintaining the old racist past of the police force and defunding it completely. The choice is between whether we maintain the only popular movement that can actually make successful reforms to the police force, that can actually fight poverty, that actually combat racism in the police force, versus completely extinguishing that movement on their side of the house. Two main points of clash for you today. Firstly, the social benefit of the progressive movement and how we can actually win as a progressive movement. And secondly, point of clash on police brutality, which is quite integrated into my split point on how it damaged the interactions of police with marginalized communities. And on this first point of the social benefit of the progressive movement. So they basically told us that we can win over additional support. There are three main responses to this. Firstly, we see that it's actually just a massively unpopular policy proposal, right? Because less than 20% of the voter base actually 20% of the whole population actually support this policy, right? So we see that progressives, when they win elections, actually win on bread and butter social issues like universal healthcare, higher minimum wage, and things like decriminalizing cannabis and expunging of past convictions of cannabis records, which actually is a very material benefit for Black people in the criminal justice system that we can actually conceivably score on our side of the house today. What do we actually get on their side of the house? Well, we basically overshadow all these policies that have, more than 70% support rates because we're pursuing this policy that is supported by literally less than a fifth of the population, and it's very unsuccessful. Secondly, what do we tell you? We tell you that only people that support defunding the police departments in the world today are typically already left-wing voters or inclined towards the left wing. People that already overwhelmingly vote for these progressive candidates. So at best, what they get is maybe a slight increase in these numbers of people. They might get some of these activists excited to vote for this, but they barely expand the vote base into other demographics whatsoever, right? So what happens in parallel is they alienate very vital voter bases while actually not expanding the support for the progressive wing on their side of the house. So this brings me to the third mechanism of how they alienate working class and middle class voters that are vitally necessary for progressive candidates to win elections, right? For them to actually get the benefits they're claiming, the progressive movement has to maintain itself as a strong force, right?
On that.
And we give you very potent reasons as to why this will not happen. And they also brought us this point of somehow they can start winning majorities for progressive movements by winning over existing black voters. We see that even the polls today tell us that a minority of black voters support defunding the police. So even if it's a minority of already a small percentage of the population, they're not going to score the majority in Parliament, the majority in Congress that they need to actually push through all the benefits that we get on our side of the House. They also told us that fear-mongering isn't really real because CNN is fairly left-wing and can provide progressive perspectives. We think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the US political scene, right? Because it's actually centrist platforms like CNN that are more willing to to actually speak out against the progressive wing, that are willing to say, Bernie, AOC is too radical, let's stick with Biden, to actually go against the more successful measures, the bigger measures of the progressive movement to actually improve criminal justice and improve society in general. So they also told us that this idea that fear-mongering doesn't work. First of all, we just tell you this is wrong, right? Because there were a lot of people in the Democratic primary that supported candidates like Bernie that were more actually willing to do stuff on criminal justice. But these people didn't win because they were told they would lose elections. They were told they were basically communist, too far radical. On their side of the house, they basically provide infinite material for these centrist and these right-wing media platforms to actually go and say, yes, they are very radical. And not only that, but sometimes voters are willing to suspend their belief and say, I'm willing to vote for, this person for healthcare sakes. But when there's physical policy evidence telling these voters that yes, they actually do take a very extreme unpopular position, then that's when things start changing and when the progressive movement starts losing momentum on their side of the house. They also told us they're going to get better suited services. Firstly, we say all the benefits of the affirming team's case depend on proving that progressive candidates who run on defunding the police are actually going to win these elections to start with, right? Something that we have definitely just proved on our side of the house. Secondly, we say that on our side of the house, because of this, we can actually obtain tangible improvements in how policing occurs. We brought you the concept of body cams, of punitive measures against abusive cops. They said, body cams can be turned off. Yeah, but the legislation that's proposed by the progressive movement on our side of the house is punishing cops that turn off their body cams, right? That is the difference here today. On their side of the house, we have a smaller police force where cops still do this. On our side of the house, we're actually going to get legislation that makes cops and be punished when they do turn off their body cams and actually get accountability. We told you that we get things like diversification of the police force, and we use things like tasers instead of guns, which is a very physical benefit for these people that are so often oppressed by the police force. But even if we take the affirming team at their absolute best and say that a theoretical defunding policy would reduce the effects of police brutality, which it won't, as I'll explain, this wouldn't be worth the cost of the electoral failure for the progressive movement, right? Because there are these vitally important other spheres of influence, like healthcare, like poverty reduction. They literally told us at first that poverty is the main driver of crime. We would absolutely support the progressive movement maintaining momentum to actually roll out policy that helps combat poverty and helps people in very material ways. Something that they're sacrificing just for potentially marginal, change in police brutality, which we don't think they'll get. That is not worth sacrificing all the benefits we can get of things like pushing forward healthcare benefits, pushing forward welfare benefits on our side of the house. They basically harm every aspect of the progressive movement on their side of the house. They also told us that their alternative is going to be investing into healthcare, right? And we say, what is the primary political force in America that can actually score allocation of funding for mental health care is literally the progressive movement, right? So at the point at which they're making this movement less popular, taking away its momentum, they lose all their proposed alternative benefits of ratcheting up, funding for all these awesome mental health schemes that they're proposing on their side of the house. Now on to my next split of how they damage interactions of police with marginalized communities. 5 main mechanisms of how they do this. Firstly, there's actually a trend towards increasing diversification and anti-racism training among police forces that uniquely applies to new police recruits, right? Because if you were, came into the police force back in the 90s, there'll be none of the accountability that you had coming in right now. They basically cut off all these newer people coming in right now. So we say that if police forces are successfully defunded, many layoffs will occur and pay cuts will occur. We see that in the world today, there are many police officers with anti-racist and progressive sympathies that are already on the fence about leaving the police force, right? So what's going to happen with sudden budget cuts, right? There's going to be lower salaries, worse hours, poorer quality policing. This is the final push to get these ambivalent, doubting people to leave. Who's actually going to stay in the police force? We see on their side of the house an absolutely disastrous concentration of the most hardline, the most prejudiced officers staying in the police force. These are people that genuinely believe they're wiping away crime from the face of the earth like the Punisher, right? They actually have a moral dedication to the force. They think they have a dedication to it. They're going to remain as cops. They're basically pushing off the people who already have doubts about the effectiveness and the policing of the police force. They're pushing all those officers away on their side of the house. I'll take a POI quickly now.
Yeah, oh, you want to take it?
And rid some of the fear-mongering.
I mean, that's literally what's been happening in the world today, and we've seen even accelerated fear-mongering, right? We've seen not just Fox News, but also CNN pointing to the polls saying it's supported by less than 20% of the population, literally criticizing Bernie, AOC, and the progressive wing on the basis of this being an alienating policy. Completely untrue. Next mechanism of how we improve the police force. We say it's catastrophic to accountability of cops on their side of the house. So not only do they lose this new diverse wave of recruits, but they only retain the most entrenched cops, right? So on a patrol, a responsible police officer could be instrumental in advising against the use of force or guns against mentally ill youth and youth of color. They lose that on their side of the house, right? Because they retain the most experienced, most entrenched people in the police force that are most dedicated to it. What else do we see on their side of the house? When we numerically reduce the number of police officers in the force, those are the people that keep their jobs. But also we see there's more over-policing of disadvantaged black neighborhoods, right? Because when the funding of departments is slashed, police forces are going to concentrate their efforts on the problem areas, right? The areas with the most high crime rates. They're going to look at their past data and say, oh, if we can focus our efforts in this area, they're not going to get any benefits on over-policing because the police will simply reallocate all their efforts towards literally policing these most high crime and most disadvantaged communities to start with. They lose all their benefits at that point. Finally, quickly, the reason why police brutality is typically carried out by old white men in a neighborhood that isn't theirs is because they have no connection and no, intimate connection to this community. We say it's ridiculous for them to say diversity doesn't work and basically dismiss the work that so many police officers are doing to reform the system right now. That's why we're incredibly proud to negate. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome up the third speaker of the affirmative team.
On our side of the house, we recognise that policing is an outdated notion which serves to reinforce outdated prejudices and outdated hierarchies. The United States has developed a police system with a culture and reputation of misuse so foul and off-putting that any attempts at reform are likely to be seen by the populace as disagreeable. 3 points of flash for you today. Firstly, around how we can best prevent crime within our communities, since we've shown this is the key issue in this debate. Secondly, around how we can actually ensure that the progressive wings of parties get their political values heard. And thirdly, around the issues of reforming versus defunding. Let's start off with preventing crime, since that's the most important. First of all, so we've got a few points here today. Educating police, kind of the tension that can build up possibly, the idea that people feel more secure under a police system, and finally the idea that the most conservative cops will be kept, which turned out to be the thesis of kind of why reform wouldn't work from their side of the house. So let's hear first of all around educating police. As Willie told you from the start, this doesn't work. We do get the bias training. The bias training comes through, and we see people actually rejecting this training. But secondly, when police are forced to face this education, they understand the goals of the movements around them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have that training there. What we've shown you is that people can't. We can't get these people to internalize this belief that they don't actually have those backgrounds in communities themselves, right? Secondly, around tension, right? And the idea that, not having these police officers here is going to be hugely damaging. They describe this as a debate-winning thing because, you're not going to have this, you're not going to have a police officer in your neighborhood anymore to defend you against a violent situation. What we offer in rebuttal to this is that police officers actively escalate tensions, right? If there is someone on a scene who is armed and has the power to arrest you at any time, that is incredibly damaging for any hopes of the situation de-escalating without violence, right? If there is the literal possibility of violence put into the situation, which may not have been violent beforehand, that's when police come in and escalate situations. And that's when the vast majority of these police brutality incidents happen. We stand for reducing that. We stand for removing these over community policing. That's what we support on our side of the house. Secondly, there was the idea that, people want to vote for the stuff because they'll feel more secure. This ties a little bit into the political values section. But what Lily's told you and what Emma's told you is, security, feeling that from the security from the police is from what is quickly becoming a minority of people in America. Very rich white people in America who actually have like the ability to feel safe and feel protected by this police force. Like, and even for them, often they don't feel safe, right? Often if you see a police officer like arresting someone in your neighborhood, you're not going to feel any safer than like if that person had just been like walking down the street smoking a blunt, right? That's not the issue here. Like the issue here is that like people are not going to feel safe when people don't feel safe with police officers in their communities. Security happens on our side of the house when you have lower crime in your neighborhood, when you have those crime rates low, when you have education, you have funding for mental health, you have funding for housing. When you have those conditions lowered so that people actually don't commit crime, that's when families feel secure, no matter what socioeconomic background they come from. Thirdly, the idea that the most conservative cops will be kept. First of all, there weren't like a whole lot of mechanisms why what we heard from them was kind of around like, you know, if they cut budget, then like only some people want to stay. What we've told you is that, you know, we're not like just decreasing the overall level of funding for the police departments. We are narrowing down certain roles and certain aspects of the police department, which you kept. That was pretty clear from your speech, never really engaged with on their side of the house. But what we're talking about is the roles that we're keeping, like investigating organized crime and going after like violent, high-profile offenders. These roles aren't going to like lose their resources. They're just the rest of the police department isn't going to necessarily be there to, you know, enforce police brutality on minorities, right? What we're talking about is keeping these roles that require intelligence. They require you. They require actually being able to look after, actually being able to understand the social conditions around you. These aren't the jobs that the conservative cops would want to stay in. And even when we have these cops who are hardline and who support their positions like the highest regard, these cops aren't likely to stay in when the police system is changing and becoming more progressive because they don't want to be involved in that kind of system, right? So we don't actually see these types of cops sticking around. What we do see is people who are actually invested in creating positive community policing come into the police force. We see that as a positive thing. We see that the remaining cops who remain after this defunding are actually likely to be more progressive ones. We see that we'll go on that point. At the end of this point, around preventing crime, we've actually shown you a problem from the first speech. We've shown you how crime is caused, and we've shown you how we can prevent it. On the opposition side of the house, they've engaged with the idea that like our crime is caused, but they haven't really represented any material for how we can actually prevent that. There's the idea of body cameras proposed later on. I'll get to that later. Secondly, the second point of clash today is around political values, right? And the key idea here was that progressive wings lose values. We'd like to look at the type of voters that they're trying to engage with here. Mostly they're engaging with like suburban housewives, right? Like the kind of the main centre, the people who are likely to flip-flop on issues depending on what they receive from the media, right? So this is a voter base that can actually be won over, right? It's not something that you need to go out there and cater to as hard as you can. However, the voters that they're actually going to lose by not backing this proposal are the communities that progressive movements are supposed to serve, right? You don't start a progressive movement because you want to cater to suburban housewives. You start a progressive movement because you want to cater to marginalized communities, to working class communities, to the LGBTQ community, because you actually want to help people who are most affected by these issues. If the progressive community steps forward and says, okay, well, we're going to start catering to like what's more popular because we want to like get this kind of vast center on our side, then like they actually lose the grounding in what they're looking for in their debate, right? Realistically, progressive movements have won on ideas that previously seemed radical before, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt came out of nowhere with the Green New Deal, which was not perceived as a good idea previously. Progressive movements have a history of coming out with ideas that have previously been seen as radical and supporting them from the top. And that's what we get through there with the idea that like there's this 20% that's not going to win this popular support. We see that this popular support can be won, right? When this idea is engaged in the media, when people are actually looking at these things, that's when we see these ideas start to come to the forefront, right? And when you have the grassroots support, the massive online campaigns, you don't just have it told to you by Fox News and CNN, you have it told to you by people around you, people on the ground, right? Through social media, through like Instagram, Facebook, you see people actually engaging with these ideas and having reasonable discussions with them without being told what to do by Anderson Cooper or Tucker Carlson, right? That's where like grassroots support out of the house, like the massive popular support that can actually come to these progressive ideas, because that's how progressivism generally gets its support, and that's what we're proud to support. Final point on that is around like how this is going to like empower progressive movements to like research other ideas. We don't see empowering progressive movements to do what exactly, right? The other policies progressive movements pursue, the ones that actually matter and impact the communities most, don't have that over 70% support. That's not what we're looking for our communities, right? The ones that they're actually going to impact people with don't have that popular support at the moment. Progressives have the unique situation where they do need to go out and campaign. They can't just condemn an idea because initially it isn't popular. They come from the bottom and they have to fight their way to the top. That is what's important about the progressive movement, and that's what we stand to preserve on our side of the house. So at the end of that debate, we've shown not only do we preserve the integrity and the character of the progressive movement, we offer a pathway for them to achieve their goals in the future. Thirdly, around reform versus defund, they just talked about how like body cameras can prevent any kind of police brutality from happening. But like the system has a huge resistance to taking accountability. It doesn't want to change things. And when it does, it blames on individual cops rather than the system as a whole. It doesn't go after the actual problems. It goes after like people who went out of their way to enforce these issues, right? So we don't actually see any kind of real reform happening through here. What we see is like them going after like small offenders and stuff, while ignoring the vast majority of the ones that maybe don't make social media or don't have a hashtag about them. So on that, there's not much material that's offered us on reform, so we see very little of a model despite having engaged with the idea that crime is obviously really bad and needs to be prevented. So we see that we win that point. In the end, what we've shown is like preventing crime is the most important thing in this debate. We need to prioritize it, and we can actually do that and still maintain the integrity of the progressive movement. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome up the third speaker of the negating team.
The moment the affirmative team came out here today and they said, let's defund the police, let's de-size it, and we will stop racist cops. We will stop, killings of black lives like, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. They said this will suddenly stop magically because we've de-sized and we've defunded it, we've solved the problem. Well, two main points, problems with the idea is first, they have to get into politics to even have this opportunity to change the power. And secondly, the ability to actually what will actually happen to this police station when this reform and de-sizing comes in. Now, three main points of clash in today's debate. The first one being about the police effect on communities. The second one about being education in the policing system. And the third one just a small support on support through these ideas. Now, for the first point of clash, which is about police effect on communities. Now, what have we heard from the affirmative team? Well, we first talked about how police, we don't want police to patrol areas, there's killings of specifically black lives is one that they've sort of brought up again and again. But they've missed there's a flaw in their case because it's not like when they're defunded they're going to leave these communities. Most likely most police will go to these areas because they're supposedly dangerous areas. They've been targeted for so long that they're the most crimes areas. So when that they're de-sized, defunded, they want to still sort of get their incentive as they brought up. But the thing is, they're going to go into these areas. They're most likely going to be more racist traditional cops who haven't necessarily had that awareness on social media and haven't seen these platforms. If they're as racist as they say, they will still go to these places. They will still control them more. Under their side, we have a small group of sort of cops that are disastrous for our society. They're sort of the more racist traditional cops that will sort of go to these areas and do more detrimental things than under our side, where we have education, accountability, which I'll touch on a teeny bit later. They talked about police unfairly patrolling these areas, but when increasing of over policing on disadvantaged black communities, when funding is slashed, they're not going to focus on higher class areas where there's no crime. They're going to focus on the most crimed areas, and they go to the problem which has been so-called identified over the last 20 years. So it's not like they're going to just leave these communities. They're probably going to go to these communities, and the cops that are going to these communities are going to be more dangerous because they're the ones who aren't necessarily the new ones. I'll touch on that later because that's been a very big point of clash.
On that.
They talked about how a lot of times cops unsorted to deal with crime, but the first response is that yes, cops may be somewhat unsuited to deal with these crimes, but what's going to be better? Police who are being restricted with funding, don't get education, still have these modern views, or police who can get education, are more new, sort of have more diversity, and they can go to regions that they know. We promise you that the second option is better because they have more awareness in our society. They know the problem, they know how to solve it. It's not a bunch of 50-year-old white cops who don't know much about different communities and diversity. We're having communities and younger cops going into these communities who know what to do and know more diversity. I will take your point of clash now, not repeat one.
Both sides agree to reduce poverty to prevent crime. Where is the money coming from if you're still spending the billions of dollars on police?
In the United States, you mean? So there's the billions of dollars that's coming from like different areas. So for example, that might be taken away from areas that aren't needed, like fossil fuels. They can decrease the spending of fossil fuels. There's a whole bunch of spare funding. Like I promise you, we don't need to spend $10 billion on like the army and military, even though we're not in any wars. So I believe there is a lot of funding that can be taken from different areas to go into this policing, which sort of increases education and increases national support. Now for the second point of fact, which is just this idea about like support through these ideas. They've came up here and they've talked about how like this group, like the Progressive Party, will get into Parliament and be able to sort of implement these ideas. Well, my first response to this is that it's just currently an unpopular policy. A lot of progressive voters, they win on bread and butter policies. They win on health reforms. They win on all these popular policies. But this policy isn't actually that popular. But why is that? Because often the way this policy is shown or is like portrayed to viewers isn't in the best light. So this is sort of like telling voters, we need to change police. There's so many killings. But in a better way to do this would be to actually educate the police and get them from in the system and not try and get them from like out of the system. So like at best on their side, we get more voters, but what they don't get is a majority vote, people voting for them, and this sort of like overrides all of the well-supported policies that the Progressive Party has, like the health reforms. It's sort of overlooked because they want like this police defunding. They talked about how like activists have a platform for social media. They can sort of like tell everyone you should vote for this through their social media platform. But if they have a so-called like good social media platform, that's why isn't voting changing now? It's not because this policy is looked down on. If we look at the report in America last year, 20% of Americans agreed with defunding the police, 80% didn't. That tells you that this policy can't get through because they've got to put it through like to Americans, and they've got to say, vote for us, and they're going to say no, we're not going to vote for you, we're going to vote for another party because we don't agree with your views. So this idea about defunding police has been suggested, but it's not very liked. That is why we have definitely won that point, just because the popularity isn't there. We can't get this through the sort of like system that they've tried to propose. The better solution would be to educate the police, get accountability and body cams, which I'm actually about to touch on. Which brings me on to my third point of passion, which is about the education on the police system. They talked about how police training doesn't work. Well, first response to this is that this is a ridiculous idea. How can you tell us that education doesn't work? Education works. That's why we go to schools. You can educate people on different ideas. You can teach them about different like ways of life. You can teach them about a whole bunch of different things that sort of opens their minds. Under our side, what we get is programs that are designed to teach about racism. It's designed to open their eyes and designed to make them more diverse, accepting people. As my first speaker brought out in our model, we also get more accountability with, like, for example, body cams. They've talked about so that they can turn body cams off. But on our side, we can pass legislations that say it's illegal to turn body cams off, which they don't get under their side. So there's more accountability. As Ron and Nick have said again and again, more legislations can help these people. You can't turn off the camera. We believe this is so much better than having a small bunch of racist older cops. They talked about how like more policies will come in. It takes time to get like new police. Well, first of all, this is a complete flaw in the affirmative case, because they've said, we'll defund them, we'll de-size them, but they're going to be more progressive, they're going to be less racist. Well, they said suddenly once police is defunded, it will lead to a more diverse, less racist police system. But why is that unrealistic? My first response is because people who will be fired are most likely going to be the ones that have been there for long, because they have relationships, they have like knowledge, they have like experience. They're not just going to say, hey, you're new, I'll keep you. They're going to say, hey, you've been here for 10 years, I'm going to keep you because we've got a good relationship and I know you're reliant. They're going to keep them more, and often these people who are more entrenched are the older ones who have more traditional views that are detrimental to these black communities that are getting like sort of like wrongly dealt with.
Point of interest.
They talked about this idea before, like, stations will keep younger police, but again, that is completely wrong, because why would a police station keep newer police when they don't have the experience? They're going to keep a good trained mate that they know and they know is reliable. They talked about how like, again and again, so this is just sort of like, they've sort of pinnacled their case on the fact that police training doesn't work, but as we've proven again and again, education and more accountability and legislations is better than defunding and de-sizing the problem. That is why I believe the move must stand proud to be affirmed.
As is traditional, we reverse speaking order, so I'd now like to welcome up the leader of the negating team to conclude their case.
down the line on the affirming team, there was basically this misunderstanding of how the progressive movement is able to actually grow its support, right? Because the way the progressive movement has enabled itself to grow to the point it is at which it is today is by embracing very popular policy proposals like universal healthcare, like $15 minimum wage. They have almost 70% support. They're able to bring together large coalitions of working class people and actually win elections. When they actually enable the fear mongering on their side of the house by introducing a very extreme position that is supported by such a small minority of the country, they actually lose not only all the benefits they're claiming on criminal justice, but they lose all the societal benefits as a whole we obtain in terms of universal healthcare, in terms of all these social benefits and reducing poverty and improving people's lives that we're striving for as a progressive movement on our side of the house today. Two main points of clash for you. Firstly, who better facilitates progressive candidates winning elections? Secondly, who better reduces police brutality? And on this first point of clash, so what we basically heard is that fear-mongering isn't effective, right? Why is this completely wrong? Because we have literal demonstrable evidence of where fear-mongering about radicalism has lost progressive candidates' elections, right? Because not only is it utilized by the right wing as they wanted to have you leave, but it's literally also utilized by centrist candidates to go against, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and cause them to lose elections, to lose out on pushing through the reforms that are very materially beneficial for people. What did we also hear? We heard that the progressive movement is going to lose working class people, LGBT people, and black people from supporting if they do not endorse, massively decreasing and defunding the police force. As I brought you earlier, they actually obtained support initially through policies with great majority support, over 70, 80% support, and all these popular policy proposals actually built the support to begin with. And when we see in the world today, when actually a minority of the black population in America supports defunding the police, we don't think we should pursue that and actually lose out on all the voter bases that they're trying to make us lose on their side of the house. They also told us that, no one actually hears news through news anymore, right? Nobody actually listens to political opinions from all these outdated modes of, finding things out. They only are told progressive ideas through left-wing social media spaces. We say the people this applies to are literally already progressive, right? These young millennials, young new generation people that are able to access left-wing social media spaces. That's literally already who's attached to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The actual swing voters that we need to expand the base to actually pass these very important laws that we want to pass on our side of the house do listen to Anderson Cooper, right? They do tune into CNN, right? They do listen to all these older modes of communication that they want to deny completely on their side of the house. And why is it so important that they lose these voters on their side of the house? It means because not only do we lose out all the social benefits of having progressive candidates winning, but they actually get none of the benefits on reducing police brutality. So onto this point of police brutality. All benefits contingent on proving that the progressives that they wanted is on proving that the progressives will win influential seats and congressional majorities. In stark contrast, on our side of the house, we score actually achievable material benefits by being elected as a progressive movement, right? We told you that we could actually achieve reasonable policies that are actually realistic to achieve, like cannabis decriminalization and expunging the convictions of past offendees, right? We got no response to this, right? Because it's a very material benefit for the black community, for criminal justice, that we actually score on our side of the house that they have no response to, right? What did we tell you? Why they told us that racist cops won't want to remain in an increasingly progressive police force. We think this is absolutely true, and that's why on our side of the house we want to encourage expanding these new ways of young, fresh people of color, young, fresh recruits coming into the system. We actually do think these racist people will eventually be pushed out. On their side of the house, that is not achieved, right? Because we saw they got no benefit on over policing, right? Because when funding is slashed for these police departments, cops are going to refocus all their efforts on these high crime areas, right? We saw they lost all their benefits there. Not only that, I told you that when there's less salaries and worse hours as a result of cuts, that's the final push for progressive sympathizing cops who already have doubts about the police to go and leave the police force, therefore concentrating all these worse cops that they have on their side of the house. Finally, what do we see in the status quo? We see a new wave of hiring young cops of color, which is entirely lost on the affirming team side of the house. We would absolutely stand for material benefits for vulnerable people, rather than an adventurous scheme on their side of the house that will cost people their lives. Thank you very much.
Thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the leader of the affirming team.
Throughout this debate, we have proven that reducing the US police force provides better outcomes for people. Key points of clash. Firstly, on safety. The negating team told us that tensions will increase basically because people feel like unsecure because they fear crime and police aren't there. Two responses to this. Firstly, in our world, as we've told you from the start, police still exist, right? Their resources are just focused on like violent offenders and investigation of large crimes. Therefore, this crime that like Neg tells us people will fear, the severe crime is still prevented and policed in our world. Secondly, police frequently, as we've told you right from the start, deal with low-level crime that will be better addressed by community organisations and governments better equipped to deal with these instances, right? So like mental health call-outs, for instance, would be addressed by social support organisations trained to deal with these situations. Therefore, people are safer because these problems are properly addressed. Thirdly, we have less over-policing and therefore people feel safer in their communities, right? Because they're not like have this fear of like being shot because they see all these police walking around with guns, and there's lower tensions between the police and people. Therefore, we won on this point because we showed that our world keeps people safer. Now, on to why reform won't work, right? So we were basically told that like the status quo is fine because we'll just have like diversity in this system. So 3 responses to this. Firstly, Black and minority cops still have to like function under the like same historically racist laws. They still have to like listen to like leaders or are informed by leaders that are making like racist decisions, so they don't actually get this like liberation. Secondly, we still see that it's Black communities that are being over-policed. Thirdly, over-policed communities are going to resent and refuse to cooperate with the police, as we currently see, because they've historically been oppressed by them, right? Like how likely is it that Breonna Taylor's family is going to be like super keen to continue wanting to like listen to the police? So therefore, the measures that the negating team offers will not actually fix the problems of crime and will likely just make police like more biased. So why does our model work, right? So we engage non-voters by campaigning on issues that actually impact minorities, such as in this case, we talked a lot about police brutality, right? We have educated leaders raising awareness and dispelling misinformation. This was like a really big point that Neg tried to run, right? But we're still telling you that like activists and candidates still have a voice, they're still going to be listened to. I told you at first, right, that like because Black Lives Matter and police brutality is really relevant, people are engaged, right? Because activists and candidates have a platform, right? And because they know that people, particularly Black communities, are suffering on the ground because they're being over-policed, right? Activists and candidates like have a campaign that is likely to be successful under our model because it's relevant to a majority of people's lives. So which side actually addresses crime? At first, I told you that crime occurs for a variety of complex reasons, right? So under our model, we address crime by delegating these like problems to different organizations and putting money into education and healthcare that allows people more life opportunities and better addresses the root of the problem and why people end up in these situations. We can see, like, even if our campaign fails, right, in the worst case scenario, minorities still feel empowered because they've had their voices listened to. We've still raised awareness of the harms of the police, and we've incentivized the government to change because they see that this is something that's really important to society. Even if conservative cops remain in the police force, in our world, they have less power because they're in control of less things, and therefore less people are harmed by these racist police. Negating tells us police are a calming figure. How were they a calm presence when they shot and killed Breonna Taylor? How are police a calming figure to a Black child who has to see cops with guns walking around their community, seeing leaders in their community being shot and killed? Therefore, we won this debate because we've shown that people are better off when the police force is reduced.
Thanks to both teams for what's been a really great debate. If you could now cross the floor and shake hands and then leave the room. Great.
Yes. Thank you.